If the American people understood what was going on, they would revolt. Okay, so I already told you guys that this right here, the interstate connection, is Ohio, Virginia, South Dakota. This is much of the racketeering that we've already established and the wire fraud, because all of these are part of wire fraud. But I know what you're thinking. You need standing. And this web does get much more complicated, but I want to talk about some of the victims in South Dakota. So I already told you that Corey Lewandowski, through in-kind payments, was acting as Kristi Noem's advisor and consultant, being paid by Donald Trump. And because he was being paid by Donald Trump, we know the value of his work to be roughly $20,000 a month, so we'll call it that. But we also know that Kristi Noem was using the funds through Go West Media to create, for $9 million, ads for herself. So she was actually taking, right, because we always want to look at when it came from taxpayer dollars, and basically campaigning. So that's illegal and it's bad enough. But remember, Ben Yoho is the one profiting off of that. Now here's where we get into the crazy crimes. Ben Yoho, we find out, just got engaged to Tricia McLaughlin. And remember, all the funneling has to go up. Tricia McLaughlin is now in the Trump administration as Kristi Noem's media spokesperson. And here's where we get into some real crime. So first, we have Go West Media. They take the $9 million, which by the way is embezzlement, and then $100,000 to WPA Intelligence Chris Wilson. Anything boxed in red are ongoing litigation, meaning attorneys are already sniffing around. They just aren't looking at the big picture. But what they do is they start the Freedom Works Here campaign. Freedom Works Here campaign is going to be the vehicle. So I'm introducing you now to another enterprise. So who would be a victim of Freedom Works Here? So what they did, and this was under legislative investigation, is they wrote an RFP for Freedom Works Here. The ads that, again, are taxpayer-funded advertisements for Kristi Noem to build her celebrity for Donald Trump. So they did this in secret, but they still put out an RFP because keep in mind, Go West Media is still a pretty new company. Most of these media companies are just shells. So 7 private businesses bid this work, including a company called Sioux Falls company, Lawrence and Schiller. This was the bid put in by Lawrence and Schiller, but keep in mind the entire process was fake. So while Lawrence and Schiller and the other 6 companies are all kind of defrauded in that sense, they had their intellectual property stolen. She allowed WPA and Go West Media to see all of the bids and then stole their idea verbatim, like everything is the same. So they're not only out the money for bidding, but all of the work that went into those sketches in creating this campaign, because it is now intellectual property and labor they can never use again to profit from. So in the case of Lawrence and Schiller, I'm not sure the current status of the case, but I do know it was surface level, not RICO. And this is a violation of the Defend Trade Secrets Act, or DTSA, which in and of itself doesn't warrant a RICO case, but it can be a predicate case as long as you're committing other crimes, which brings us to extortion and embezzlement. Now keep in mind, none of this would have happened if it weren't for the in-kind payments to Corey Lewandowski, the outgoing funds to Go West Media, and the vehicle that is Freedom Works Here. So this is where we have extortion and embezzlement, even though I would argue that these guys are also guilty, because after taking our taxpayer funds to campaign for herself, she asked private companies in South Dakota to donate $10,000 each to be featured on her social media campaign. Now, why is this important? Because as I'm making the argument that Kristi Noem was also giving in-kind payments, right, in the form of celebrity, we now have her selling, basically, herself to advertise for people. She was also doing this for free on Go West Media's page, which is very illegal. There's a case about that. But she got $250,000 from private businesses to donate to ads just about her to Freedom Works Here. The problem is none of these companies ever got employees. So they were asked to give money in exchange for her to recruit employees and residents to their community, but she was completely unable to do so. We don't know all of the companies, but we do know some CEOs that backed it, like Michael Bacorny. He's the CEO of Aberdeen Development Corps. So I'm also going to argue that the McCook Lake victims are directly impacted by Freedom Works Here. Now, Freedom Works Here meant that we had to warrant this workforce housing. What's going on with workforce housing is so bad that unless I have good legal representation, it would be against my own safety interest to tell you everything I know about workforce housing, but I can tell you it involves obstruction of justice and embezzlement. It did involve human trafficking, but that RICO case was already tried, and yes, they were charged. But then we need to look at the transaction to Transition Studios, because she took taxpayer funding to Transition Studios, which the Dakota Scout was looking into, in order to create a documentary about her. And this was in order to kind of amp her up as somebody that would, you guessed it, be good in the Donald Trump administration. Now, that might not seem like a big deal until you understand that that happened on June 23rd, 2024. Oh, and of course, Elon Musk's ex is who got exclusive rights to it. Now, how could a natural disaster be part of a RICO case? Well, the issue here is that on that evening is when this flood was happening, and she deliberately came to the McCook Lake area and told people that it wasn't going to flood, it wasn't going to be bad. Sirens, nothing. She came to McCook Lake and told people that this wouldn't happen, all while diverting water to this particular neighborhood in order to protect areas that were in her best interest, such as the workforce housing. But the real predicate case here has to deal with bribery and obstruction of justice, as well as those in-kind payments from Corey Lewandowski. So keep in mind, on this day, she would have been with Corey Lewandowski, and he would have been acting as her advisor. So not only did she have that direct conflict of interest, but Corey Lewandowski, as being paid by Donald Trump at the time and advising her, also had a conflict of interest, because it was in his best interest for that transaction to Transition Studio in his state of Ohio, and in order to benefit Elon Musk's ex, he would have had to advise her on the night that that documentary was coming out not to warn people that there was going to be a major natural disaster, because this story needed to be around this propaganda piece that they were airing on X. Additionally, there are direct links to workforce housing and Corey Lewandowski. It's a long story. But something else really interesting happened in the McCook Lake community. Not only did she not warn people, not only did she divert water to this McCook Lake neighborhood, but she refused to call a declaration of an emergency for several months. And part of that was because she has always used the operation of, hey, we're not going to take federal funding because that means federal investigation, which has always gotten her in trouble. So she denied people FEMA access, and anything that they needed to get their lives back on track for over a month, which violated the Stafford Act. And while it is not a RICO, predicate case to deny funds, it is obstruction of justice and bribery when you do so in order to cover up the crimes that you are committing. So here is where we get to the bottom, how they get the funding going upward, and then it gets a lot tighter and scarier over here. I'll do that part later. So let me know if you want more. This is how I prepare for articles and trace things. I put a lot of work in, and I'm not necessarily sure why, but this is how I organize my thoughts. You could always click the orange card. You have a lot of school supplies like this Sharpie in there. That will help push the message out, even if you don't buy. Otherwise, maybe I should just start selling these posters. I don't know.